It's an island within a city, born from the fertile Midwest plain. It's an island within a city where once...
Located in the southwest corner of Norwood Park Township, have a very long and rich history. When Columbus discovered America, the area was mainly prairie, inhabited by the Potawatomi Indians, and it stayed that way until the 17th century when the first white men came. There was a river called the Chicago, so named for the strong-smelling wild onions growing along the banks, and it flowed into the Michiganong, place of great water, now called the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. Nearby there was another river, named the Aux Plains by French explorers, and now called the Des Plaines River.
In the 1770s, a man named Jean-Baptiste de Sable became the first non-Native American to be a permanent settler in the Two Ridge area.
He built a trading post, but later sold everything to Jean Lalime and moved on. The Potawatomis accepted both men, but in 1803, soldiers came to build a fort of logs, Fort Dearborn, to mark the western boundary of the new United States of America. The local Indians became more hostile towards white men as more and more of them came to take away their land. In 1812, war broke out, and as they abandoned Fort Dearborn, the settlers were attacked by Potawatomis. 60 people were killed, and the fort was burned. Friendly Potawatomis saved Captain and Mrs. Held and an army sergeant named Griffith, and brought them to a man whose mother was Ottawa and father British, but who lived with the Potawatomis. He was called Chichipinqua, Squinter, or Blinking Eye, but the Helds and Griffith called him by the name his father gave him, Alexander Robinson. He brought them to the British-captured fort on Mackinac Island. When he got home, Chichipinqua found some more people from Fort Dearborn, including the John Kinsey family. He hid them for a few months and brought them to Detroit. During the war, Chichipinqua stayed by the burned fort and farmed. When the War of 1812 ended, the fort was rebuilt. In 1818, Illinois became a state, and many people settled near Fort Dearborn, which had begun to be known as Chicago. In 1831, Cook County was formed, and in 1833, Chicago officially was chartered as a village, with a population of 150. That year, many Potawatomi Indians came to Chicago and signed a treaty which gave the land around Chicago, including the Two Ridges, and they all left between 1833 and 1835. The last of the Indians to leave staged a farewell war dance through the streets of the young village in 1835.
Many people moved to the Two Ridges as soon as they were open for settling because they felt Chicago was too muddy. Those people included Mark Noble, Phineas Sherman, and Herman Frazier. Also new settlers to the Two Ridges were Israel, Marcellus, Gustavus, and Waldo Smith, who all bought land on one of the ridges. That ridge came to be known as Smith's Ridge, now Union Ridge. Israel's land now belongs to Ridgemore Country Club and St. Rosalie's Church. In 1836, Alexander Robinson, Chichipinqua, moved on to Robinson's Reserve, a 1,200-acre forest granted to him for his helping the Helds and Griffith, that is now the Forest Preserve areas titled Chichipinqua Woods, Robinson's Woods, and Catherine Chevalier Woods. Catherine Chevalier was his wife. In 1837, John Pennoyer, after whom Pennoyer School is named, arrived with his daughter Susan and his sons Stephen and James. Francis Tanner, Charles Ball, and Herman Raleigh also settled here about that time. By 1839, the area had many well-established farms. There were many children living in the two ridges, and in 1838, a small school was built at Higgins Road and Canfield Avenue. This was the first James Penoyer school, and James and Susan Penoyer were the first teachers. The John Foote family, the William Dunlop family, the Jacob Wingert family, and the Jacob Klein family all settled here about that time. About 1840, the Leiden Indian Agency House was built near the 1800 block of Lawrence Avenue. In 1849, Leiden and Jefferson Townships were formed, each taking up part of the two ridges. In 1851, the Poor Farm Jefferson was formed. Now there were several roads. One was a north-south running stagecoach trail called Township Line Road, now called Harlem Avenue. A dirt road between Israel Smith and Marcellus Smith's properties was called Smith's Road, but is now called Gunnison Street. Parallel to this Des Plaines River was Skunk Road, now Cumberland Avenue. Crossing the Des Plaines at the Brooks Tavern was Brooks Road, now East River Road. Plank Road, so called because it was made of wooden planks in an attempt to create a road usable all year round, is now Irving Park Road. Talcott Road was named for U.S. Senator Mansell Talcott, who was buried in the Union Ridge Cemetery in 1857. On what is currently Higgins Road, a part of Henry Smith's farm became a cemetery, and Henry is the first person buried there in 1841. This is now Union Ridge Cemetery, a small cemetery with most gravestones dated between 1841 and 1940. Adjacent to the cemetery was a farm, which was expanded in the 1870s by Norwood Park village leader Thomas Seymour. It is now the Noble Seymour Crippen House in a historic site located at 5622 North Newark Avenue. It houses a historical society.
As the 1860s approached, feelings about slavery reached the point of war, the Civil War. Israel Smith was a strong abolitionist. He believed slavery was wrong. Jesse Ball went to Kansas for a time to assist the abolitionists there. John Foote, Henry Tanner, Leodore Tanner, and Solomon Burhams all served and returned to the ridges. However, Arza and Zabina Ball both died, each at the age of 19. Two sons of Allen and Harriet Hemingway were also killed.
In the late 1860s, many people in the ridges began to complain about the way their taxes paid to Leiden and Jefferson Township were being used. The roads in all other parts of the township were in good condition, but the two ridge roads were terrible. George Dunlap, a resident since 1840, decided to do something about it. In 1869, he built a two-story frame house at what is now Norwood Court and Circle Avenue. Two other houses and the Norwood Park Railroad Station were quickly built. A store and a hotel were also built. This tiny town was named Norwood Park. This is because at the time there was a very famous book, Norwood, A Tale of Village Life in New England by Henry Ward Beecher, and they wanted their town named after it. The park is because there was a Norwood post office in Chicago at the time.
In 1870, on the grounds of the Country Poor Farm and Insane Asylum on Old Plank Road, a new modern hospital with accommodations for 300 patients was built. The farm and hospital area came to be known as Dunning, after Andrew Dunning, who moved here in 1865 and who donated land to the railroad that connected Chicago and the hospital. The Giles family moved here from England and settled near Irving Park Road, later moving to Lawrence and Canfield, where the Baptist home is now. During 1870 and 1871, George Dunlop worked to bring Norwood Park to life. However, there was something that took everyone's mind off politics for a while. That was the Great Chicago Fire on October 9, 1871. An area of Dunning was used as a common burial ground for unidentified victims of the fire. Some ridge residents lost their Chicago businesses in the fire, including Israel Smith. Most people regarded it as a catastrophe, but one person loved the missing buildings. That was Chichi Pinqua, who rejoiced at being able to see the prairie again as when he was young. In spring of 1872, he died. He is buried on a corner of his preserve at the corner of East River Road and Lawrence Avenue. His stone reads, Alexander Robinson, Chichi Pinqua, chief of the Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Ottawa Indians, who died April 27, 1872. Catherine Chevrolet, his wife, who died August 7, 1860, and other members of their family are buried on this spot, part of the reservation granted him by the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, July 29, 1829, in gratitude for his aid to the family of John Kenzie and to the captain and Mrs. Harold at the time of the Fort Dearborn Massacre. Legend has it that every Halloween Eve, Chi-Chi Pinquezgos pops out for a look at the ridges.
In 1873, everything was ready for the birth of Norwood Park. The officials of Jefferson and Leiden called them the pretended town of Norwood Park because if county and state officials recognized it, they would lose tax money. However, 20 of the 30 Norwood Park residents who could vote had signed George Dunlap's petition and Norwood Park was born. On April 1st, the first government officials were elected. They were Supervisor Stephen Penoyer, Assessor Jesse Ball, Collector Frederick Klein, Justice of the Peace John Foote, and Highway Commissioner Israel Smith. There were many more children now, and more schools were needed. In 1875, Charles Ball donated land for the Union Ridge School, known as Smith's Schoolhouse, either because it was near Smith's Road or because Miss Kitty Smith, Israel Smith's daughter, was the first teacher. Children walked along either Smith's Road or the cinder path now called Oak Park Avenue to reach the school. 2 years later, Lawrence Gunther sold part of his farm, which lay several miles southwest of Smith's Schoolhouse, to local school directors. Adjoining land had been bought for a school about 27 years before, and a 3-room school was built. It came to be known as the Annex because the land had been annexed from Leiden Township. It sat on Old Plank Road near present-day Ozanam Avenue. The village florist shop now sits on that land.
In 1889, Jefferson Township became part of Chicago. In 1893, most of Norwood Park also became Chicago property, but the area of the two ridges was not annexed at this time. Just north of Irving Park Road, William and Mary Ann Phillips of England purchased 10 acres of land in 1873. Part of that is now Acacia Park Cemetery. A road running north along the edge of their property became Phillips Street, now Ozanam Avenue. Near Phillips Street on Lawrence, Frederick Harris bought land in 1884. In the 1890s, Jared John and Peter Van Bergen bought farms.
Israel Smith, after 65 years on his Union Ridge farm, died in 1904 at the age of 88. John Foote, resident since 1840, died at 68 years of age in 1908. At 85 years old in 1908, resident since 1835, Gerhard Franzen died. Leodore Tanner, who was also born in the Ridge area in 1846 and lived there his whole life, died in 1908. Resident since 1844, George Klein died in 1911, and his brother Frederick died in 1914.
The area's first permanent church was formed in 1903 and at 5650 Canfield Road, a former onion field. A building was erected in 1904. It was St. Paul Evangelical Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and the first pastor was the Reverend August H. Lang. During his first 19 years, services were entirely in the German language. In 1912, the church opened a parochial school. It is the second oldest school in the area after Union Ridge School.
In 1908, the Irving Golf Club bought the entire Israel Smith farm and turned it into a 9-hole golf course. Israel's home became the clubhouse. From December of 1910 to June 1912, people on the poor farm of Dunning were gradually moved to Oak Forest Hospital, and only the mental patients were left. On June 29, 1912, Dunning was sold to the state of Illinois for $1. It was renamed Chicago State Hospital, but was still known locally as Dunning. In 1914, the country club on Israel Smith's farm officially became Ridgemore Country Club. That year also marked the beginning of World War I. The area does not seem to have suffered as many losses from that war as in the Civil War. In 1915, James Giles built a new farmhouse at Harlem and Montrose.
The segment of Old Plank, Irving Park Road that runs through the southwest corner of Norwood Park Township was paved in the early 1920s. So were Harlem and Narragansett Avenues. John Kinsey Estates were also created around this time, a small area just off of Old Plank, running east of Ozanam, subdivided by a building company. In 1922, Mr. Street Lightfoot created Acacia Park Cemetery on the Phillips Farm north of Irving Park Road to Montrose, west of Ozanam to present-day Thatcher Road. This cemetery was originally for members of the Masonic Order. In the early 1920s, James Giles moved his home by truck to Lawrence and Overhill. In the 20s, almost all of the area farmers were truck farming, growing crops, loading them into a truck, and driving into the city to sell them. They would load their trucks and drive to markets on South Water Street or Randolph Street in downtown Chicago. During the 20s, there was a lot of activity involving schools. In 1922, the third school named for James Monroe Penoyer was built at Canfield and Higgins, where the first Penoyer school had originally been built. In 1924, Union Ridge District 86 merged with another district, and enrollment at that school jumped from 33 to 153. A two-room building was built, and 3 more teachers were hired. In 1927, a school with room for 125 students was built on the annex property by Irving Park Road and Ozanam Avenue. It was obvious that this building wouldn't help the onslaught of students, and thus 5 acres of land were acquired from John Sass, and a new school was built at the corner of present-day Cullum and Oriole. The school was finished and named James Giles School in 1928. It was an 8-room building with a small assembly hall. In September 1929, the 53-year-old one-room Union Ridge School building burned down. A new brick building with 4 rooms was quickly built. In June 1928, the Acacia Community Presbyterian Church was formed, and for a while they held services on Ozanam Avenue. The first pastor was the Reverend George Cleaver. The United Lutheran Church of Illinois Synod sent A. Roy Addy, a student minister, to the area. He began a mission church and a rented store at Irving Park and Overhill. There were 36 members. When United Lutheran Church officials discovered that the Episcopal Church of Norwood Park was selling their building, they bought it for $300 and moved it to newly purchased land at Oriole and Cullum, across from Giles School, and it is still located in that spot. A. Roy Addy was ordained a full-fledged minister and the first pastor of the new Acacia Park Lutheran Church.
At this time, some non-farmers living in the tiny residential area building in the unincorporated area north of Irving Park Road began to complain. They tried to get annexed or joined to Chicago, but area farmers were against it. They had no need for the perks of incorporation and were content having good, paved roads such as Irving Park and Harlem nearby to get into Chicago to sell their goods. They thought that annexation would happen anyway, as a building boom was expected to happen. However, Black Thursday occurred, and those hopes went out the window as the Great Depression began. Farmers set up roadside stands to sell produce and rented them to fireworks sellers in July. Fireworks were legal in Illinois then. Giles School became a fundraising center. The PTA woman crocheted lace to sell and raised money for coal to heat the school, shades for classroom windows, and more items. Various community events were held in the small auditorium. Entertainment was simple and very inexpensive. Groups would chip in to go for hay rides on pitch-black roads at night. There was a 2-story building on Oquito in which community dances were held. A pianist supplied the music, paid from the money dropped in a hat passed among the dancers. There were roadhouses along Irving Park Road, restaurants with live entertainment and dancing. There were also 2 gambling casinos, one reputed to be connected with Al Capone. There were also several milk stores on Irving Park and Harlem. People brought their own bottles and paid for how much milk filled the container. Many people had their milk delivered by a milkman driving a horse-drawn wagon or truck. However, this was expensive. More people moved into the area during the Depression since it was an unincorporated area and there were less taxes. A good house could be bought for as little as $2,500. A teenager named John Lee came here with his family at that time.
In 1937, Acacia Park Cemetery sold half its land, which became the West Lawn Jewish Cemetery. In 1938, Durocraft Homes created a subdivision south of Foster and west of Harlem, taking in present-day Octavia, Oconto, and Odell, and built 70-some houses. Also in 1938, Michael Enright built the landmark pub at Oriole and Foster, an establishment that is still around today. The Great Depression officially ended in 1939. One day, many area farmers were listening to the radio, perhaps of the Chicago Bears versus Chicago Cardinals game being played at Old Comiskey Park, but were interrupted with an announcement about Pearl Harbor being bombed. It was December 7th, 1941. During the war, many German prisoners were sent to work in the area's farms that lay between Harlem and Cumberland, Irving Park, and Foster. Some liked what they saw and later came back and became citizens. In 1942, the Hale American Tournament in golf, an equivalent to the National Open which wasn't held that year, was held at the Ridgemore Country Club. Also that year, a fire destroyed the Acacia Community Presbyterian Church's building. For a while, the auditorium at Giles was their church, but in 1944, ground was broken for a new building. That building still stands at the corner of Oriole and Cullum, on the southwest end, across from the school. The Second World War ended officially in 1945, in September. The next 5 years saw a population boom for the southwest corner of Norwood Park. This boom led to the birth of the island within a city, Norwich and Harwood Heights.
By the end of the war, the island was still almost exactly as at the end of the First World War. West of Harlem was still mostly farmland. In 1947, outdoor movie theater was built at Harlem and Forest Preserve Drive, the Harlem Avenue Outdoor Theater. There was a panty farm, a warehouse called the Onion Hall that was a wartime factory, and a home owned by Judge Heckel at Harlem and Gunnison. It was a landmark of the time. The farmers were happy, but the residents of the two residential sections weren't. Unpaved streets, flooded basements, no police, inadequate water supplies. It was near impossible to have a hot bath, and after 20 years of the area being unincorporated, not much had been done. Now that things were getting back to normal, they wanted something done. They once again thought about annexation, but Herbert Huming was one person who was all for annexation, having moved to the area between Foster and Lawrence after having served in the Navy for 3 years. He and some neighbors formed a group to push for annexation. Huming visited City Hall in Chicago several times to try and make it happen. However, Chicago wasn't really interested. The group had another idea in mind, though. They decided to find out what needed to be done to incorporate as a village of their own. By fall 1947, he had everything ready and a vote was taken. The result, 354. Thus, Harwood Heights was born. There is no official record as to how the name was chosen. Legend has it that Har is from Harlem Avenue, Wood is from Norwood Park, but no one knows where Heights came from. Another legend says that a number of area homes were built by Harwood builders, and the names comes from there. On March 4th, 1948, with a population of 400, Harwood Heights was chartered. It was 4 square blocks, bounded by Foster on the north, Lawrence on the south, Harlem and Oquito on the west. Herbert Huming was the first president. That same year, the parish of St. Eugene Catholic Church was formed at Foster and Canfield, and Father John M. Ryan was the first pastor.
The other residential area between Irving and Montrose was going through the same things. There was an organization called the Annexation Improvement Club, who had tried for years to achieve annexation. They had talked with 48 Chicago aldermen to date. They became Chicagoans, but after 30 days they were left out in the cold once again. An area resident since 1941, Joseph Seep, said, "Why don't we just incorporate ourselves like Harwood Heights did?" At first people were opposed, but eventually saw his side. The northern boundary was decided to be Montrose, Irving Park on the south, on the west was Ozanam, and Harlem on the east. It would be a rectangle, with Forest Preserve cutting off one corner. Mrs. Link, a member of the group, suggested that they take Nor from Norwood Park and Ridge from nearby Park Ridge and make Norridge. On December 4th, 1948, a vote was taken and resulted in 578 for and 195 against. The Annexation Improvement Club became the Norwich Improvement Club. Carl A. Kuchar became the first president. In Norwich, their first office was a room in the village clerk's home. Village meetings were held in the Norwood Park Township Firehouse at 4348 Ottawa Avenue for 5 years. In 1951, Joe Seeb became Norwich president and is still in that office today. Harwood Heights that year annexed the area from Argyle to Ainsley Streets west of Harlem, and in 1952 annexed the remaining land southward towards Lawrence. In 1953, 7300 West Lawrence became the home of the first industry of Harwood Heights, Magnaflux Corporation. In 1954, Norwich annexed northward from Montrose to Lawrence and began housing development. They began working on the first official village building with 2 offices and a garage. It is now the police station. The new water system, containing a reservoir, pumping station, and fire hydrants, was also completed.
School problems also resulted from this rapid growth. In 1950, an addition was built at Giles, but then they had to take on the annex's children as it was closed for boiler repairs. Union Ridge had had only 200 students a decade earlier, but now was teaching 275. They sold bonds and raised enough money to add on 4 classrooms and a lunchroom. However, in 1953, enrollment jumped to 403, and more bonds were sold to build a second floor over the additions. John V. Lee, currently the School District 80 superintendent, got a new school built, which was named for him, and pushed to renovate the annex. Unfortunately, there was a fire on June 21st, 1953, and the annex burned to the ground. A split shift was begun at Giles to accommodate the annex students. It was abolished in 1954, when the North End addition was completed, which houses the kindergarten through 4th grades currently. That year, the Norwich Youth Association, the NYA, was also formed.
A new way of shopping was forming in America. Shopping centers were popping out all over the country. In 1955, with Joe Sieb's encouragement, a plot of land at Harlem and Irving Park, formerly a miniature golf course and driving range, became a mall. 45 firms were chosen to be this new mall, many of which are still including Fannie Mae Candies, Walgreens, and Woolworth. The shops formed an L with Weebolt, now Carson Perry Scott, at the corner. It was not enclosed. This new mall was named after Harlem Irving Plaza, nicknamed the Hip. On the electronic sign during the early 1980s, a small hippo would occasionally appear eyes first because of its nickname. However, most area residents just call it the mall, and Little Hippo is now just a memory.
In 1955, there were 4 more beginnings, including that of a church and a school. The church was called the Church of the Open Door, now the Bethany Baptist Church. It was organized the summer of 1955, and the Reverend Douglas Fisher was first pastor. Services were held in the Edison Park American Legion Hall at first. The school was the 4th James Penoyer School, the present building, located at Cumberland and Foster, still unincorporated at the time. Another beginning was Norwich Community Park District. They bought land between Wilson and Lawrence, a total of 22 acres. Last but not least was the completion of the Divine Savior Church building. It was to be used for the school, and the ground floor was only to be used for masses until a proper church could be built. It is still used for masses, but the proper church is becoming more of a reality now. Father Walter Morris was the first pastor.
In 1956, attempts to create a village of Ridgemore and a village of Union Ridge east of Harwood Heights across Harlem, an unincorporated area, both failed. They were joined to Harwood Heights. Also that year, the Central Baptist Home for the Aged, formerly located in Chicago, bought 9 acres at 7901 West Lawrence Avenue, and Chicago annexed everything else around the 2 villages and created the island within a city. In addition, 4474 North Harlem became the home for the new Maurice Linnell Cookie Company factory. People were moving to the 2 ridges in great numbers. In 1957, the entire present-day east end of Harwood Heights, running to Narragansett Avenue, was annexed. A big building, a farmer's warehouse in the 20s, a dance hall and gambling casino in the 30s, a factory in the 40s, located at 4301 Harlem, became Stark's Warehouse and began selling surplus supplies from World War II and the Korean War, such as shoes, rainwear, and blankets. It burned down March 25, 1980, taking decades of history with it, and was replaced by Unity Savings and Loan at 4242 Harlem. Also in 1957, the John V. Lee School's 2nd floor was completed, and the first classes were held there in September. The The lower floor was completed in 1958. Union Ridge School District was annexed to Harwood Heights that year. However, there still was no high school. The citizens of the island paid a special tax so their children could attend nearby local schools in Des Plaines and Chicago. But in 1958, a law was passed to abolish all non-high school districts in Illinois. They'd either have to form a district of their own or be assigned to one, which could turn out to be an inconvenience. But the island residents had already been thinking along those lines, and District 234 was quickly formed on July 12, 1958. A contest was held to name the school, and from Norridge and Harwood Heights, the name Ridgewood was chosen.
The Church of the Open Doors, now Bethany Baptist Church building, was completed in 1958 at 6700 West Gunnison. Work began on the first St. Joseph Ukraine Church at 5000 North Cumberland. Father Sherry had been holding masses when he could for 2 years already. St. Joseph's Manor was built nearby to provide homes for the families that wanted to be close to the church. Also in 1958, Goodman's Community Discount Store opened, located at 4731 North Harlem. It was soon known as just Community. In 1959, Pennoyer School, in a then unincorporated area, asked to be annexed to Norridge and became part of the village. Although it was part of Norridge, it remained an independent school system. That year, 5 tennis courts were built in Norridge Community Park.
At the end of 1959, there was the old established part of Norridge from Cullum to Olcott south of Montrose, with tree-lined streets and the homes dating back to the 20s and 30s. The established part of Harwood Heights was east of Oriole, from Lawrence to Foster, with trees and light industrial buildings. North of Montrose and west of Oriole were newer homes, less trees, and new lawns with little grass. There were 6 schools, a number of churches of different denominations, and the hip. There were also several riding tables along Cumberland, Higgins, and Lawrence, including Rocking H Stables, Idle Hauer Stables, and the best remembered one, Happy Day Riding Academy, at 4700 Cumberland, where Butera now stands.
The early 1960s were largely a time of openings and completions in the 2 communities, our local history book reads. St. Rosalie Roman Catholic Church opened in 1960 at 4401 North Oak Park Avenue with Father Clement H. Conrad, first pastor. The First Baptist Church of Norridge opened at 4701 North Canfield Road with the Reverend Walter Schmidt as first pastor. Ridgewood High School opened with Eugene V. Howard as superintendent and quickly became recognized as one of the top 10 schools in the country. An annual fun fair was held for the first time by the St. Joseph Ukrainian Catholic Church on Cumberland Avenue. Work was also begun on buildings along Lawrence between Overhill and Ozanam. One was an A&P. In 1961, the south addition to Giles was completed. That is where the 6th through 8th grade classes are held now. In 1962, Norridge Pool was built, and a year later, the first high-rise of the northwest Chicago suburbs was built, Parkway Towers. Also in 1963, Giles built a kindergarten wing, offices and teacher's lunchroom, and St. Rosalie School opened. At 8600 West Lawrence Avenue, the Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church opened with the Reverend John Bejes as pastor. 1964 saw the present Harwood Heights Village Hall and the vocational, training, and science rooms at Lee completed. In 1965, ground was broken and $1,750,000 was paid for the building of the Science, Industrial Arts, and Library Wing at Ridgewood. In 1968, the Franzen farmhouse was torn down. It was more than a century old. It had stood on East River Road between Foster and Bryn Mawr. That year, the Wesleyan Church of Norridge bought the Acacia Presbyterian Church building, located at 4526 North Oriole, and it became the Christ Wesleyan Church with the Reverend Ronald T. Terry as pastor.
In 1968, Ruth Igo, Kay Kupchik, Carol McKenzie, Joseph Patricelli, Tony Wallanen, Natalie Rothbart, Martin Snyder, and other people formed a group called Friends of the Library for Norridge and Harwood Heights, and they began to try and fund an area library. They felt a community without a library was a bit like a body without a brain, and a year later held a drive for membership and funds, and held a Name the Library contest in the schools. James Scallion, a sixth grader at St. Rosalie, was the winner. Eisenhower Library opened its doors after 2 years of work. They'd received a federal grant of $129,000, and they rented a bookmobile and set up shop in a cramped office in the rear of the newly completed Parkway Towers. In 1973, they held a vote to see if residents would be willing to pay for the library out of tax money, and they did. That year, they bought their own bookmobile and moved to a former sheet metal factory at 4652 North Alcott in Harwood Heights, their present location. Also in 1973, St. Joseph Ukrainian Catholic Church began to build a new home. The work of 34 architects was looked at, and the design finally chosen truly stands out with its golden turrets.
In 1975, expansion work was done on the hip, and in 1976, 16 more stores opened. That year, the Alcott building, rented up until that point, was bought, and in December 1975, the bookmobile was sold. Ron Stotch, current library director, was the last bookmobile driver. Meanwhile, the Happy Day stables were being torn down for more stores. However, people complained that the two ridges were becoming too overdeveloped, but ceased complaining when an arsonist burned the stables down. The Eagle Grocery Store, Red Lobster, Fashion Nation, and other stores were built there. In 1977, the outdoor theater was torn down. It is now Norwich Commons, housing Parade of Shoes, Dominic's, Pearl Vision, Venture, two dollar stores, service merchandise, Musicland, Silo, and many other stores. Work on a 28-store addition and upper-level parking deck at the hip was underway, and the next year Eisenhower became some remodeling work of their own. In 1979, Community was destroyed, and Harwood Square, containing Blockbuster Video and Subway, among other stores, stands on that spot. In August 1979, the Church of the Open Door became Bethany Baptist Church as a result of a merger. That year, the old Giles family farmhouse burnt down. Condominiums stand there now. The fire was apparently vandalism by people who had no interest in our area's heritage. In 1980, Stark's Warehouse burnt down, another historical landmark. In 1985, Axel roller rinks closed after being around since the Korean War. In 1987, the Des Plaines flooded. Holiday Bowl, around since 1959, was demolished in 1988. It is now Holiday Plaza, home of Crown Books, Kuppenheimers, and Office Max, among others. At 4600 Harlem, Joseph Lumber Company outlet was partially torn down and converted to another shopping mall. The Dunning Hospital grounds, remember that place, was purchased by Norwich, and 13 acres were built by Harlem Irving Realty Company, 15 by Ray Venture Limited, and adjoining land was the new site for Wright Junior College. In 1987 and 1988, the hip gained Main Street, now Kohl's, an upper deck parking level, and the north wing was renovated. Also at that time, Weebles closed, a sad event for many residents who enjoyed shopping there. In 1988, became Carson Perry Scott.
At the end of the 80s, there was the Phillips House just inside the cemetery gates at 4212 Ozanam from the 19th century, a 125 or more year old farmhouse at 7710 West Irving Park Road, the remnants of Chichi Pinqua's reservation along the Des Plaines, a few remnants of Israel Smith's farm on the Ridgemore Country Club grounds, the Giles School from the 20s, the Landmark Pub from the 30s, but everything else was not much older than the two villages. There is always change going on in the island. There are new condominiums on Lawrence, and ones being built on Irving Park where the bowling alley used to stand. Eagle recently became Butera, and the House of Fabrics in the Norwich Commons Shopping Center is closed. Change can be good, but very often it can destroy our visible past. That is why the Young Adult Club at Eisenhower Library has made this video, to teach the island residents about our past, so history will have less of a chance of repeating itself. The information was found in Island Within the City by Tom McGowan, Norwich resident and author, published in 1989. And in the local history vertical file in the Triton room at the library. The curious can find a gold mine of historical information there. Don't let history repeat itself.
There's an island northwest in Chicagoland, Norwich, Harwood Heights is how it's known. Lake Michigan to the east, Des Plaines River to the west, growing in a world of its own. It's an island within a city, born from the fertile Midwest plain. It's an island within a city, where once there were waving fields of grain. There's Lee and Giles, Union Ridge, Menoyer, all names that helped the island grow. There's Ridgewood High, a strong and proud tradition, and Norwich Park looks lovely in the snow.